I remember my reaction the first time I heard someone say something along the lines of science is racist. I think it was something like, wait, what? No, no. But fortunately, I let myself listen, like step by step in small increments, and I've certainly come to understand that science is in fact something that humans do, and human beings, well, we're flawed and hold biases, so science, can be impacted by that. This month's topic or meeting is our speaker, Stephanie Zvan, who is the Associate President of Minnesota Atheists, and she's going to give us kind of a talk about science's kind of racist past, what it's doing to improve, and talk about maybe the challenges that it still faces. So please welcome Stephanie Zvan.
So as Alyssa alluded to, this is not necessarily a topic that you expect to find at most atheist meetings. So first of all, I just want to let you know that there may be some material in here that some people will find disturbing. The history of science certainly includes dehumanization of both some people and some groups. We'll be talking, in fact, a little bit about genocide, about slavery, more than I would like about human experimentation. And there are also some racist caricatures that will at least be referred to in here. So why am I bringing this up at an atheist meeting? In part, I'm doing this because we continue to see racist pseudoscience shared among atheist groups, a lot of times in informal groups, but not always. Unfortunately, some of the big names in atheism still occasionally share racial pseudoscience. I'm talking about it because we've been told we're not supposed to. And I'm not really keen on the idea, oddly enough, of making this, in particular, taboo. So when Steven Pinker says that talking about racism in science is waging a war on science, I look at that and I see somebody trying to shut me down, and I don't do that. Also, talking about it because we do actually have a mild tendency in atheism towards scientism, and we also have a bad reaction to being told that, and we have a really reasonably bad reaction to being told that, because frankly a lot of religious people accuse us of scientism on a very low basis. Scientism, I prefer a definition that the American Academy of Sciences uses. It comes from philosopher Tom Sorrell. Scientism is a matter of putting too high a value on natural science in comparison with other branches of learning or culture. Sorry, American Association for the Advancement of Science, big overarching science group here in the US. And while some religious people tell us we're using science to disprove God and that's scientism, one, I don't think we actually do that very often. And two, even if that isn't very good critique, we still have to watch ourselves for getting into scientism. Science is the best tool we've got for an awful lot of things. We have to make sure we don't misapply it. So, talking about science, I mentioned it's the best tool we have for a lot of things. You're probably all familiar with the scientific process. This is one of the better ways that we get information about basically what is happening in the natural world. We make observations. Based on those observations, we make hypotheses. We then do experiments to test those hypotheses. We analyze the data from our experiments. We draw our conclusion about what that tells us about the hypotheses that we made. a very human endeavor. And at every stage of that, human bias creeps in, despite the fact that it's the best process that we have. It isn't a perfect process. It'll never be a perfect process because people do it. So when we are making observations, we often have very limited experience. We can't observe what we never come in contact with. When we're making our hypotheses, we have a lot of previous beliefs that we walk in with. When we are doing experimentations, which experiments we do depend on what kind of funding we can get and the biases of the organizations that provide that funding. When we make choices about how we go about those experiments, those can also bias our results. Once we've done the experiment, we have data to analyze, we make choices about how we do that, both what we test and how we test it. And then we have to make conclusions based on those analyses. And we will often come to conclusions that prop up our existing ideas. This is something we do in every realm. Unfortunately, science isn't immune to it. There are also biases that come in terms of how we communicate science. Unfortunately, one of the major issues that we have with lay understanding of science these days is what they call science by press release, which means the public comes to understand science based on whatever it is that the scientists and their press officers at the universities have had to say about it. Neither of those things actually necessarily go through peer review. So there are opportunities there to skew things as well. I'm sharing these pictures in part because I just adore them. These are from an experience where 7th graders went and drew their idea of what does a scientist look like. I think we've all seen the before pictures. They tend to be white men, funny hair, lab coats. There was a project that took a bunch of these kids after drawing these to Fermilab to actually meet the scientists there, talk to the scientists. Afterwards, one of them, Amy, drew a woman in regular old clothing. The other one drew, I love this side by side, same posture, same everything, except that now the scientist is black, also wearing red clothing. As it turns out, you don't wear a lot of lab coats at Fermilab. But if we look at who actually does science, maybe not the funny hair, but the white guy part, it turns out, is still a pretty decent stereotype. The pie chart on the left is the US population, broken out white men and women, black men and women, Asian men and women, other, which is a combination here of Hispanic or Latinx and people identifying as multiracial. If I actually split that out, you can't see that on the working scientists' side. You can see it in the US population, it's actually fairly big, but both black men and women and other men and women are grossly underrepresented in science. When you look at the white population, women are grossly underrepresented compared to men. So when we were talking about things like experience and basing our hypotheses on observations that we've made, we still have an issue because not all of these people have the same experiences in our society. So I'm going to take you back a little bit further, talk about really what we consider the dawn of science. The scientific revolution started with the publication of On the Revolution of Heavenly spheres by Copernicus, 1543, pretty much considered to end with the publication of Newton's Principia, mathematical principles of natural philosophy, which Copernicus started by really driving the science with observation as opposed to preconception. Newton is considered to end there because he was, part of the reason that he derived so many laws is he was one of the first people really thinking that there was value in doing that. And so our scientific revolution is basically a revolution in terms of how we observe, how we test, how we synthesize. This is still an awful lot of science that we follow that comes out of this period. But if we're talking about racism, there are some things that we should know that happened during this period. 1542, the year before Copernicus published, Spain issued new laws on colonization. Those new laws forbid slavery of indigenous people, which was great until 4 years later, the Viceroy of Peru was killed for enforcing those laws. Another 6 years after that, those laws were rescinded and replaced with something that was much weaker. This was a period of time that started with us being perfectly okay enslaving groups of people. 1543, first year of the scientific revolution. Martin Luther, this is not him nailing anything to church walls. This is him publishing a book, the title of which translates to On the Jews and Their Lives, in which he said we should take away their property. We should not allow them to own any more. We should destroy synagogues and their holy texts. We should forbid their rabbis from preaching. There's actually a quote in there where he says, "We are at fault in not slaying them." This is Martin Luther. This is one of the major thinkers of the time. In 1564, the British slave trade, which brought most of the Africans who were enslaved in the U.S. to the U.S. was started. That expedition was funded by Elizabeth I. Francis Drake was part of it. John Hawkins, who started it, was granted this coat of arms, which you can't see it very well. It's not well made, it's not survived well, but one of the central parts of that is a bound black man. That was his family legacy and what they put on his coat of arms. In 1591, the Songhai Empire fell. Most of you have probably never heard of it. It was among the largest of African empires. It was not the largest, it was among them. It fell because the Sultan of Morocco was looking for gold to compete with Christian Europe. One of the major cities in Songhai was Timbuktu, which you have all heard of. In London, or in 1400, Timbuktu was larger than London. This was not a small thing. This was not a small empire. It extended from the western coast of Africa well into actually the Saharan desert. We managed to take and hold an empire over that kind of land. But Morocco needed gold, so it was perfectly fine to come in destroy the empire by force, despite the fact that no Westerners had even seen the land. Westerners, Northerners, we call them Westerners, it's all messed up. Until 1812 or possibly 1826, according to most historical records. And it was considered of so little importance that we did this, that basically this empire is now considered more legend than history. Here in the US, we have the Peacock War in 1636 to 1638. Pequot was a tribe around Delaware, Maryland, that area. Happened because a British man kidnapped 2 natives, and the Pequot killed him for it. In 1637, it included what is called the Mystic Massacre, which was the complete burning of a town of 400 to 700 plots.
Can you speak up a little more?
Try?
I mean, I lose your voice once in a while through the mic.
Right. Okay. And there were no survivors in that town. And while I bring this up because it has a very nice set of dates, it's simply representative of the kind of genocidal tactics that we used here in the US. It was completely okay to try to wipe out an entire group of people. 1671, some good news. Quakers visiting Barbados to ask for an end to slavery. They did, however, later send a letter to the governor of Barbados, just saying, hey, we're not working for an uprising here. We're just asking you, with the goodness of your heart, just let's stop slavery. It's bad. Which I mock a little bit, but they were Quakers. This is kind of how they approached an awful lot of things. But at the time, the Quakers were pretty much the only large group of people working to end slavery. And they weren't entirely in agreement on it either. That's 1671, coming up on the end of the scientific revolution. 1686, just before it ended, we had the Battle of Buda. Holy Roman Empire took back Budapest in Hungary. It was an outing organized by the Pope. When they were successful, what they did was go in and kill 3,000 Muslim Turks and 500 Jews. The ones they didn't kill, a lot of them were sold as slaves. So, while a lot of great things happened during the scientific revolution, it was not exactly an enlightened time in terms of how we conceive of race, in terms of what we think it's okay to do to people who are not the race that we share. And in fact, a lot of those ideas in terms of what it was okay to do to people informed that science, because that science was finding a way to say that all of this was okay. Some racist scientists from the time, although these are mostly post-scientific revolution, because I don't want you to think it all ended at that point. Charles White was a pioneering surgeon. He, like many, many scientists at the time, was something of a polymath. It's easier to do when science isn't as fixed, when you don't have as many things to learn before you can go on and do new work. So he, like many of them, was very involved in the classification of mankind. one of the things that he said while doing this. But to the European on the one hand, and on the other, to the African, who seems to approach nearer to the brute creation than any of the other human species. The African, more especially in those particulars in which he differs from the European, approaches to the ape. This is a period of time in which those scientists who were still religious were arguing over whether there were multiple creations, so that different human races, as they were classifying them then, were not created at the same time, did not have, but those who were looking at evolution were doing pretty much the same thing. Did white people and black people actually come from a common ancestor? And it was not an uncommon thing to argue that no, they didn't. Hegel, you've probably heard of, if I probably mispronounced that because German is so not my thing. If you have argued with creationists at all, you have probably seen his lovely diagrams of embryos, some of which were more interpolated than based on actual samples, which is why creationists like to argue over them. But he was a naturalist, one of the best science illustrators of his time. He was the guy who popularized Darwin's theories in Germany. He also said, talking about the history of creation, the Caucasian or Mediterranean man, Homo mediterraneus, has from time immemorial been placed at the head of all the races of men as the most highly developed and perfect. Daniel Breton, who founded, one of the founders of modern anthropology, I should say anthropology when it started, was hugely involved in this classification. There were early anthropologists who were involved in the efforts to bring back people to display in circuses and zoos from other countries, particularly from the South Pacific and from the Amazon, and of course from Africa. The quote I'm giving you here is from one of his lectures in 1890. A white man entails indelible degradation on his descendants who takes in marriage a woman of a darker race. And any relation other than that of marriage, no matter if it does lift the lower race, is unauthorized by any sound moral code. Still more to be deplored is the woman of the white race who unites herself with a man of a lower ethnic type. He's calling people cucks, honestly. Charles Davenport was one of the early directors of the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. He was involved in eugenics, created the International Federation of Eugenics Organizations. He also created the World Institute for the Second Nations, which is not a word we hear very often anymore, thankfully, but it basically means having sex with somebody who isn't the same race you are. However, that happens to be classified at the moment because it's changed throughout even this history that I'm going through. Groupings have changed. He tended to treat correlation as genetics, which is not uncommon for his time. We weren't really able to look at genes directly. But he basically just assumed that anything that was expressed in somebody's behavior was genetic. He wrote a book on heredity based on these ideas. It was used as a textbook. Race crossing in Jamaica is not a textbook, but in it he says, well, we also would not deny the possibility for further development of primitive peoples, especially by additions to tradition and by the early intensive culture. So, despite the fact that he was characterizing everything that people did as genetics, he didn't necessarily think that was hopeless. That does not state that we agree that all such primitive peoples have the same natural endowment. So maybe if we work really hard at it, we can pull some of them up, but probably not all. James Watson, one of the first people to describe the structure of DNA. This is not a quote of him, this is a news article because he tends to say things in front of live audiences, often where he is not being recorded. In 2000, he left an audience reeling by suggesting a link between skin color and sex drive, hypothesizing that dark-skinned people have stronger libidos. I will actually get to where that came from a little later. Also, his hope is that everyone is equal, but he counters that people who have to deal with black employees know that this is not true. And while I would love to be able to say that Watson's influence on science was basically back in the day when he was talking about DNA, it's not. He was serving on boards of lots of organizations. In fact, I think Cold Spring Harbor, at the time that this information came out, that he had been saying these things. Most of those he was eventually removed from because of this kind of thing. But until it was actually made public, this was still influencing our scientific bodies. Racism has also meant that we've done lots of things in science that we should be really, really not proud of. This is a statue of Marion Sims, who is the father of gynecology, the first successful vaginal fistula surgery in 1849. He developed that surgery working on slave women. Fistula, by the way, is the opening that happens after labor, caused by a tear between the vagina and the rectum. It was not a pleasant thing. It's a very good thing that we have surgery for it. But it was developed on slave women. It was developed on slave women without anesthesia. He did at least go back once he perfected the technique and fix all of those fistulas that he had been working on for a very long time. But then he went on to treat mostly white women with anesthetic. You've probably heard of the Tuskegee study, full-name Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. It ran for 40 years, from 1932 to 1972. As of 1947, 15 years in, less than half the time of the study, penicillin had become the standard treatment. Treatment was still withheld from the subjects because the point of the study was to follow the progression of untreated syphilis. You may not know a whole lot about what that's like because penicillin is amazing, but it involves things like bacterium eating holes in your brain. It very, very strongly affects the nervous system and in some really incredibly unpleasant ways. And for 40 years, these folks were allowed to live untreated. 25 years of which there was excellent treatment. The first 15 years of which there were treatments that could at least mostly stop the progression. One of the doctors, John Charles Cutler, who worked on Tuskegee in the 60s, toward the end of this, had also already worked in Guatemala on another syphilis study, not in the US, in Guatemala, which involved infecting people with syphilis in order to study it. You may also be familiar with Henrietta Lacks. She was a black woman, a tobacco farmer, I believe, who got cervical cancer. In the 50s, her cancer cells were taken without her consent and used to grow a cell line for experimentation. That was actually not anything that was particularly out of the ordinary for the time. That's not even particularly racist. However, that cell line became it became tainted, basically, in order to try to get their very, very good cell line back. The organization that had control of it called her descendants in, said, "We need blood samples from you." They didn't say why. In 1980, because of the importance, or in the 80s, because of the importance of the cell line, the family's medical records were basically released to the public. In 2013, their DNA sequencing was published. They didn't know most of this as a family until they were contacted by the reporter who wrote this book, who did help them get some kinds of compensation. Believe it or not, your cells can still be taken and used for that kind of thing without your permission these days. It is quite possible, however, that if you are not poor and dark-skinned and working in tobacco fields in West Virginia, your family will be treated a lot better over it. There are also major issues with basically a lack of science. Health studies for a very, very, very long time have included almost exclusively white people. For most of that time, it was almost exclusively white men, because apparently hormonal cycles in women make us just too hard to study. Even though that might be really good data to have to protect our health. In 1993, Congress passed the Revitalization Act. That act was an improvement, but it required basically that funding agencies and research agencies create guidelines to include more people, so that the results they produced would be more generalizable to everyone. In 2015, Sam O and other researchers put out a paper called Diversity in Clinical and Biomedical Research, a Promise Yet to Be Fulfilled. They discovered that less than 2% of more than 10,000 cancer clinical trials funded by the National Cancer Institute included non-white people. I'm not just talking black people, I'm talking any non-white people. In 2015, 22 years after that law was passed, less than 5% of NIH-funded respiratory research included racial and ethnic minorities. As it turns out, this is a significant issue because albuterol doesn't work very well in people who are not white. It is our go-to for treating asthma. If you can't breathe, you will be given albuterol and you will breathe better. Unless you're black, in which case about 60% of people classified as black have genes that mean albuterol just doesn't work very well. So they don't get to breathe. we haven't really developed treatments for that. Something like 40% of people classed as Hispanic, they don't get to breathe because we haven't studied how to help them. So I'm going to shift gears here. I'm going to talk about what is called scientific racism. You'll notice that I put scientific in quotes. There's a reason for this. In addition to all the problems that just plain old, everyday, absolutely respectable science has had, there are also groups of people who work very hard to produce scientific results that prop up racist ideas, that prop up racist politics, that kind of thing. I'll get to why I'm talking about this at the end. So, the part of this that most people are familiar with are things like IQ studies of race, that little thing that Watson was talking about, or at least referring to. In order to even understand that this is a problem, you have to have some background on studying race. So I'm going to walk you through this. The biggest problem that we have with race as a scientific concept is classification. If we're talking about something like sociology, it's not as hard a problem because we are talking about who gets treated as black, who gets treated as Hispanic, who counts in terms of their interactions with the rest of the world, because that's the part that we're studying. This is what we refer to sometimes when people talk about race being a social construct. That doesn't mean it's not at all scientifically valid, it just means that it's only valid when we're talking about studying social interactions. It gets a lot harder when we're talking about inherent characteristics of people, because while before people like Watson came along, we didn't necessarily know that we were talking about genetics. Now we know that we are. So we're talking about whether, for these studies, race is a scientific, genetic category, or a set of categories. And in order to do that, we have to talk about why do we categorize things in science. And we do it based on validity. You take basics science courses, you'll get much more information on validity. But from a lay perspective, and this works for what we're talking about, what makes a category valid, according to Webster's third new international dictionary, it has distinct characteristics of recognized importance. So a category does not share things with this other category, otherwise they're all the same category. And what differentiates those two categories are important. Go a little bit further into validity. What makes it valid scientifically? Are we actually describing something that's there? That's what science is supposed to be about, underlying reality. And also, can we categorize consistently? Can we describe these categories in such a way that somebody can reproduce them? Because otherwise we don't have reproducible science. So early genetic testing resulted in some very distinct racial categories. We could maybe split this data. This, by the way, is completely hypothetical data. It's based on a study, 2003 study, but I made it up. It has never been plotted this way. It's basically data on genetic distance between people. So we've got the one group up in the corner, we've got the group down below that we could maybe split into two, but they're a long ways away from the other and they're not that far away from each other. And then we've got the kind of dispersed group on the side. And looking at these studies, people said, yeah, okay, we have distinct genetic races. There's a little problem with that. This is where that data was sampled from. We have up in the top, we have France, we have Poland, we have Northern Europe, where that group was sampled from. If we're looking at white people to see if they're separate from black people, there's a whole big space we haven't even sampled from. And what we're actually testing when we're looking for genetic races is we are looking for separation in distance between these groups. And we are looking to see whether we have that in humanity, or whether we have a whole bunch of people who are more or less related to their physical neighbors, and less related to the people who are further from them, and even less related to the people who are further away, but not any real distinct categories. So when we're looking at this study, it took a bunch of groups around the Democratic Republic of Congo, took a bunch of groups that live in and around South Africa, sampled those, took 3 or 4 European countries, and about half a dozen East Asian countries, and said, yep, those are very distinct groups. We've sampled more people since then. We've sampled a lot more people, and you'll see that we've done a lot to fill in those gaps. But we do still see some places where we might want to make some breaks. We have the Sahara here. Not a lot of people live there for obvious reasons. Some do, not a lot. We have parts of Asia that are very slim, but there aren't people kind of butting up against each other. And I'm laying this over the map, but we're really talking about genetic distance. It just so happens that where we're sampling from is fairly close to what we're actually seeing in terms of distance. But you can see that distance, for example, out here, between Iceland and Norway. There's nobody actually living in that space of water, but as it turns out, Iceland was mostly settled by folks from Scandinavia, so there's not a lot of genetic distance really between Iceland. Sorry, I'm using a library computer and getting some of their messages. So we're seeing as we sample more, we're getting lots of people actually closer together, but there might still be some lines. So this is about the state of one of the major studies when they started using computers to determine how many groups there were, which is a great thing because it takes out some subjectivity. However, people still have to program these computers. It turned out that when they use this kind of data, and data including the Americas and all of that, the folks who did a study in 2002 said, yeah, we've got about 6 races. They more or less align to what we think of races. There are actually like 3 in the Americas, according to this software run. But yeah, race. Who knew? There were also a whole bunch of other runs of 6 groups, splitting it up in different ways, all about equal. There was also a run of about 13 groups that was actually the best run that they had, the best fit for the data. They threw that out. So we have data here, and we parse into groups. Then some folks noticed that, you know, if we look at that data, we can kind of spot where the big universities are and the big research projects, and we might be oversampling some of our data and undersampling some of our data. So they sent people out to like the Himalayas. They sent people a little further from the coast in Africa. They did a bunch of stuff in the Americas that's not represented on this map. And as it turns out, it fills in a lot more of those things that look like maybe they were gaps. And if you run your computer models again, you find they're a worse fit. So more or less as, sorry, more notifications. They're having a nice chat. They're getting work done, but they're having a nice chat. And if we take away the map, I'm not really sure where to draw any groups on there. I mean, I could make some guesses, but I also know that that looks like a world map. And I know that I'm biased to see that world map that I've been seeing all my life. But if I actually look at the studies, I look at the longer we study this, and the better we make our data, and the less we tell our software what to find, the less we look like we're divided into groups. But that doesn't stop people from going ahead and doing that anyway, and saying, well, it's just genetics. Because there are basically things that these folks want to prove. It's not exactly kind of Meta's fault that this showed up on his blog, because he publishes a lot of things, a lot of content having to do with atheists, and he was particularly not picky about it at the time. He's improved. But back in 2001, he published this graph of IQ versus religiosity, which you'll notice that the very high IQ countries are in Scandinavia and Northern Europe and not very religious, and the very religious countries are down in Africa with a low IQ. And very few people question that, because it promotes our biases. We want to be smart. We value that a lot in the secular movement. And it wasn't until people actually looked at the footnotes and said, wait a minute, that comes from Richard Lynn, and is published in Intelligence, the data. And it helps a lot, you know, who these folks are. Richard Lynn, I will quote Tim Wise, who did the background on this, but I have also looked into this. Another of the definitive studies cited by Lynn, which makes it into the chart that we just saw, was a 1929 study, back before Nazi Germany, back when eugenics organizations were popping up everywhere, in which 293 blacks in South Africa were given the Army beta test, not an IQ test, and scored a mean of 65. But this test was administered by Emil Fitch, an open protagonist of the view that blacks were inherently inferior. even before he had done any studies to prove such a thing. He was, in other words, hardly a pure unbiased scientist. Furthermore, the beta test was one of the most culturally biased tests in the world at the time. One question, remember, this is telling you how smart you are. On the 1929 version, the dispute showed people playing tennis without a net. To get full credit for the question, one would have to draw the net in the picture. So remember, if you don't know how tennis is played, you're not smart. And this is the kind of quality of the data that he uses, and he is relatively typical in this. At some point, I still want to go back to get my PhD in anthropology of science, because one of the things that I have noticed is a pattern of basically whitewashing citations. So Richard Lynn published in 2009 data that went into this. One of his sources was from 1929, using this information. There are others of his sources that involve saying, well, we've discovered that countries that are close to each other tend to have fairly similar IQ, so for these countries where we don't have data, we average the countries around them. But that doesn't go in the studies that just give you information by country, because they've been whitewashed. We will generate these results in ridiculous ways, and then we will present them to you as though everything is wonderful and above board. Look at this, pages and pages and pages of citations. Richard Lynn is also the person, one of about 3 researchers who provided most of the data for the particular controversial chapter in the bell curve. That's where it came from. That's how it got there. The Pioneer Fund is an organization that exists to fund studies on IQ and race. When they started, they were very upfront that they wanted to do this in support of eugenics, that they had particular things that they were setting out to prove. They were trying to get the right people to breed more, literally. They have funded some relatively decent things, the twin studies at the U of M that everybody has heard of. There are issues with those studies that people don't know about, but they study some relatively respectable, or they fund some relatively respectable science on top of that. But the other things that they fund, the things like Lynn and folks who work with him and get cited along with him and cite each other and create that whitewashing, they fund a lot of that, to the point where they have been listed as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, because that's what they exist to do. Although if you ask them, they say they exist to look into politically incorrect studies that can't otherwise get funding. You know, there's a gap. Pseudoscience mill also includes journals. It's very easy to pass peer review if it's you and a small group of people all peer reviewing each other to get the results you want. Again, founded in 1961 by a eugenics organization. Even at the time that it started in 1961, anthropologists were criticizing it for providing an incorrect view of the current situation. Guess who edits it? It's edited by Richard Lynn. It is hard to exaggerate how small and insular this pseudoscience mill is. Philip Rushton you look, he was also the head of the Pioneer Fund. He was one of the influential folks promoting that theory that James Watson was talking about sex drive in those scary dark people. He was really, really gung-ho about this theory. He was a Canadian, got banned from doing student research in Montreal, I think, after he would just hand out to his students surveys on their penis size and sexual habits and all of that. He did it, of course, without approval for human studies. When he couldn't do that anymore, he went down to the local shopping mall. Started handing surveys out to strangers. The university also censured him for that. He ended up not being able to do human research after a while. So he went on to head the Pioneer Fund and hand out a bunch of these grants to folks. That particular theory is literally the theory that we are going to be overrun by little dark people because they breed like animals. That the RK selection theory suggests that there is a group of animals, and it started specifically in animals. I'm not talking about racism at this point. That there is a particular group of animals that have very few offspring, invest a lot of research, or invest a lot of resources in those offspring. So they are going for a quality strategy. And then there is a group of animals that will lay 10,000 eggs and disappear, and hope that because of the numbers of that, some of those will continue to survive and procreate. They're going for a quantity strategy. And so Rushton is literally suggesting that white people are going for quality over black people who are going for quantity. And this is literally the theory that people are talking about when they are talking about white genocide. They're talking about the idea that white people are the quality people who are going to be outbred. Nancy?
How influential are these people you're talking about, though?
I'll get there, I promise.
Okay.
Rushton had a particular version of this theory that they call Goldilocks Theory, because I have left out the fact that on these IQ tests done by race, Asians, at least Asian Americans, but also sometimes Asians studied in Asia, outperform white people. So do Ashkenazi Jews. Rushton was studying Islam. What he basically was trying to prove was that people who are smarter, Asians, Ashkenazi Jews, have smaller penises and breed less. People who are dumber, black people, Hispanic people. Hispanic people, by the way, are people who speak the same language. That's what we're talking about in terms of racial categorization. Black people, Hispanic people have bigger penises, but they're dumber. And the Goldilocks theory is that there are white people. Skin. Heather's got it. They're not too small. They're not too large. They're not too smart. They're not too dumb. They're in the middle, and they're just right. There are also think tanks that are invested in propping up the pseudoscience, the American Petroleum Institute, and the NAACP did a big study finding that the increased exposure due to environmental racism put a bunch of African Americans at risk. Said, no, it's just genetics. found a study to prop that up. The Heritage Foundation released a report saying immigration would be terrible for the US. It was put out by a guy who had done his dissertation in college on the idea that Latinos have a lower IQ, again, based on shared language, not genetics, and that bringing them in, that was something that would never correct itself, so we would be lowering the quality of the US. American Enterprise Institute made Charles Murray, who was one of the authors of The Bell Curve, an Emeritus Scholar just this year. Now, is this actually a problem for science? The fact that there is all of this pseudoscience being done. It is. It is not as much a problem in mainstream science as it is in our understanding of science. But our scientific understanding still advances through throwing out bad theories, bad hypotheses. And if we are not getting rid of this pseudoscience, we're not advancing. There are journals that are still continuing to publish this stuff. I mean, there are mills, journals that exist only to publish this stuff, but there are, because these people manage to generate a bunch of citations and make themselves look somewhat legitimate, and because there's a major problem in how we fund science journals, some of this stuff still gets published in mainstream journals. It has occasionally gotten published places like Nature, which is what is considered a glamour magazine. Part of the reason that it's a problem is because if you are, for example, studying you don't necessarily know squat about genetics. And we have not done necessarily what we need to do to have that interdisciplinary knowledge. Jonathan Marks just put out a book last year called It's Science Racist. He talks about the acceptance that these ideas still have in mainstream science. If you espouse creationist ideas in science, you're branded as an ideologue, as a closed-minded pseudoscience who's unable to adopt a modern perspective, and who consequently has no place in the community of scholars. But if you espouse racist ideas in science, that's not quite so bad. People might look a little scant, but as a racist, you can coexist in science alongside them, which you couldn't do if you were a creationist. Which I think says something really important about the role of the role that scientific racism still plays. So, for example, Rushton, his Goldilocks Theory, E.O. Wilson, who's a major evolutionary biologist, wouldn't condemn his work. Was given plenty of opportunities to do that. He says, I don't agree with it, but you know. That's the state that we're in currently in science. I think part of that is that it has actually been made taboo to talk about this within science as well. I blame Steven Pinker in a large part. The blank slate did talk about problems, real problems that were occurring in science in terms of politics affecting what was acceptable to talk about. I think it really overstated it, and I think it has been picked up and run with by people who do not want this out of science, so that any time you actually critique this stuff, you're told you're just being political, when what you're really doing is critiquing bad science. So how do we address racism in science? Well, we test our assumptions. A bunch of studies that just came out last year. First one, Crawford discovered that pretty much all of the genes for light skin, which were thought to have been a recent development after humans left Africa, nope, they're there in African populations. And that goes along with other information that we have that suggests when we lost our hair, we probably weren't dark right away. We probably hadn't developed those genes, which makes a lot of sense. Robinson tested DNA found in a bunch of ceramics, ritual ceramics, discovered that materials found in Ghana, which is just next to Ivory Coast, Africa, had actually come from northern Africa, and were cultivars that had originally come from East Asia, which gives us a much better idea of how much trade and people moving around there really was in what we'll consider prehistoric times, at least for the area. Barnett and Freed did a test on did a study on the idea that, well, Head Start is just useless because people's genetics reassert themselves right away and everything's lost. What they found was actually that when we go from our small pilot tests that show lots of promise to the big scale studies, that sounds like a great idea because that's more data. We're not scaling up very well. We're not actually giving the large scale programs the resources that we give other preschool programs, that we give pilot studies, that we give schools. So we probably shouldn't expect them to perform quite the same way. Sneakers there did a big analysis of the genes that have been associated with IQ. They found 52 genes. It accounts for about 5% of the variation in IQ. So as we are going directly to the source, we're finding there's some influence there. It's probably not what we've been thinking. So as we test our assumptions, as we actually go out and study these things, as we look at them directly, as we do studies that can challenge our basic, we're finding that, yeah, we're actually getting rid of some racist knowledge. We need to do a whole lot better at throwing out pseudoscience. I mentioned Charles Murray, the author of The Bell Curve. I mentioned that chapter on IQ and race sources. Sam Harris had Charles Murray on his podcast in 2017 and said on there, for better or for worse, these are all facts. In fact, there's almost nothing in psychological science for which there is more evidence than these claims. He basically embraced that entire manufacture and whitewashing of pseudoscience. It's not his area. He probably doesn't know all that information. But if he's going to take it out there, he should. And he should be careful about what he's sharing. There are groups that are sharing much better information. The American Anthropological Association has put together a website on information about racial differences. It's really quite good. You can also go over to the Science Museum and see the exhibit that they put together with the American Anthropological Society on that information. So, you know, we're fighting it. We're getting out there. And every time we do, we're training up a new generation of scientists better. There are a few things, however, that won't work. Ignoring the history of science, making it taboo, avoiding the current issues that we have, none of those are going to make science better. Because science only gets better as we challenge it, as we ask questions, as we work to improve methods by criticizing the old ones. So it is better than it used to be. It's an awful lot better than it used to be. It's not there yet. And when people talk about having a distrust of science, when they're concerned about what science has to say about them, they've got not a bad basis. But if we listen, and if if we do something about it, we can make it better.
All right, do we have any questions?
I think one of the ways of correcting this, in recent years, there have been a lot of letters to the editor and opinions in Science, Nature, and all the ASM journals that negative results are no longer published. I think a lot of experimentation goes on where it would be important to publish negative results. If these negative results were known, I think we would take a more legitimate course in how our science is proceeding.
That's an excellent point. Negative results, for those who don't know, is basically talking about a study where you have a hypothesis and your data shows that it's not upheld. And when we have some old racist hypotheses and we test them, it would be nice to get that out there if it doesn't hold up. And there are ways that people get around it by framing their hypothesis differently, but it would still help. Yeah, I agree.
I think it would be interesting to move away from studying race to studying racism. And
Well, I think we really probably need to do some of both.
well, this is true. I mean, race as some kind of solid content. You pretty much debunked that race is this social construct, which doesn't mean it isn't real, but there's some sort of hard biology behind it. We know. But maybe we're not paying enough attention to the role of racism, say, in health and well-being of populations. I have a public health degree. There is that work going on, but maybe it needs to be funded better and done better.
Oh, absolutely.
And the other thing is, I would encourage you, if you continue to develop this very fine piece of work, to look at racism within race, in terms of things like Buck v. Bell and the eugenics movement, especially in the 1920s, with the idea of removing defectives to purify the white race, and laws against help me out, I can't see it, misogyny. Anyway, and I hate to have to run, but I do need to go. And thank you so much.
And I will just add also, if you go to, for example, the Science Museum's project, you will see something in there about race and blood pressure. And one of the things that studying this has brought out is that folks with origins in Africa don't necessarily have any different genetics when it comes to blood pressure, but they are subject to an awful lot more stress in the form of racism, and stress affects blood pressure.
Other questions? Raise your hand.
Thank you. Thank you very much for highlighting these points. I love that you're getting this out there and not allowing it to be taboo. Help me understand. I did see the science exhibit a long time ago, and it's like there is no such thing as race. We're at this point, we're so blended across the continents and over time. That's my interpretation. And yet you pointed out that with certain populations, for example, that medicine doesn't work. How do you draw the line in an experiment? How do you define this group versus that group? How do you, maybe you don't use race as the category, maybe you use those with gene X or something. I don't know. How do you try to study that group that seems to be having a challenge with what's known?
So one of the things that you find sickle cell anemia is a really good example of that. This was considered to be basically a black disease. It's considered to be an African disease. And people use that to point to say, well, see, there is this genetic difference. But if you actually open up your population to diverse points of origin across the globe, what you will find is that the genes for that are found around the equator. So the further you get in Africa from the equator, the less likely people are to carry the genes for sickle cell anemia. The closer you get to the equator in other places, the more likely people are to carry that gene, because what it does is provide you some protection from malaria. Does that help?
So trying to look at it maybe look for the grouping in a different way.
Right.
Maybe.
Well, what you will find is groupings in a different way,
Yeah.
but what we have broadly is a need for diverse research populations.
Absolutely.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm not aware of this kind of presentation. That's not really what I came to hear. I came to do some homework here, but then I started to see this, and it became an interesting subject. Something I have to study with and to listen to. But question I have for you. If the presentation you made today, if one is to get to read more of it, where do we get this information attached to you?
If you're interested in my laying out a lot of the information that I did on categorization,
It seems to be
I have a
well.
blog post on that. If you're interested more generally in the topic of racism in science, I would start with Jonathan Mark's book that he put out last year, which is just Is Science Racist? It covers a lot of very good information well.
Okay. Well, you seem to made up really well for somebody that has some problems.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. But I still need to get a little more into it.
And this is meant for a general audience as well, so.
Okay. All right. So to do more start from, is that Jonathan Max? Is that the name?
Jonathan Marks, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for attending. Any other questions?
This is less a question and more another example for you, which is how they study TB. Tuberculosis, there are a lot of different strains of TB that you can get, and it's usually determined by your ethnicity which strain you get from, because strains develop at different points on the map, basically. They spread it that way. But it's still, so what I've seen professionals do is it's really inefficient just to go by race, but there's also a use to it because then you can follow people across country lines. Because I didn't know there was an outbreak of TB in California at the time amongst Asian immigrants in California. At the time, they didn't realize where the source of the TB was coming from, and they realized it's only infecting this population because it's the strain that originally had come from Asia. And so you see like this weird difference between the research knows that this isn't a thing, but the doctors are still telling you to come in and get tested because they have to make the assumption because they don't have any tools to even tell you what.
Right. Point of origin is very much a thing in epidemiology, country of origin, all of that stuff. That's why you get asked if you've been on a farm in the UK if you're going to give blood, or you probably don't anymore. I think it's been long enough since the mad cow outbreak.
No, it's still there.
Still there, okay. I got a tattoo, so it's been a while. But yeah, we haven't figured out how to handle that messaging, in part because we still raise people to believe that race is a valid thing.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The skulls on the side, what is that from?
Those are Morton's diagrams of skulls. If you have read The Mismeasure of Man, you are familiar with the controversy over them. So basically what Morton did was determine IQ by filling skulls of people from, well, he didn't determine IQ, he determined that genetics determined IQ by taking the skulls of people from various parts of the globe, filling them with, I think it was millet, which is a terrible use of millet, just eat the stuff, and measuring the internal capacity of the skull. And yes, people with big, round skulls tended to be smarter. Stephen Jay Gould, when he wrote This Measure of Man, went and resampled a portion of the skulls that were available to him at Morton's research university. He determined based on that Morton had cheated. A few years ago, a bunch of people from Morton's university went back and sampled the skulls that were available to them, which was a different set from the ones that Gould sampled, and they determined that no, Gould had cheated. And really, what we know at this point is that your brain capacity has absolutely nothing to do with your IQ. So they're not, at this point, people are still fighting over a question that we has no relationship to anything to do with race and IQ. So it's an in-joke. Thank you for asking.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll do one more.
Here's the microphone.
If I can give you if not the reliable source, at least another reliable example, sure we all figure out Goldilocks science guy. He does a secondary, more serious TV series called The Eyes of Nine, and he talked about race on one of the episodes. I just figured I'd tell you that as a reliable source. Thank you.
I have not seen that.
It's really good. I recommend it.
All right. And any last questions? Give you one more chance. All right. Thank you, Stephanie.